Thank you. That was wonderful. So we have time now for questions if people have questions. I guess my question to both Liz and Erin, can you talk about the time from when you conceived wanting to write this book and then writing it and then all that and then getting it published? Like, can you talk about the timeline and the process for that, how long that process took? Liz, do you want to go first?
Sure. So with a book like this, actually, the first thing that I do is write a proposal. So I spent probably a month thinking about the structure of the book, what would be in the chapters, what the tone would be like, what research I would use, what sources I would use, and putting that together into a proposal. So I did that. And then, unfortunately, the publisher that I worked with, who has published a number of my books, kept saying they were interested, but were also kind of sitting on it and not making an offer. And I don't usually sort of start writing until I know there's a publisher interested. So what happened is that once I got the offer, the 2020 presidential election was looming large, and we really wanted to have the book out, well before November 2020. So I ended up having to actually write the book really fast. So for me, that's like, I would say 6 to 8 months. I was helped by the fact that I had my proposal had laid everything out. So I knew exactly what chapters, what subjects I was going to be writing about. I had a real pathway to getting it done, but it was also an enormous amount of research. I think I had over 500 notes in the back of my sources. So, and it was also different in the fact that it was very much like a lot of books that I write, I have experiences or I do interviews, and this was actually building on a lot of work of other people, like their research and their polling, and so it was also a really different experience for me to be writing something that was like maybe just like the biggest research project you've ever done, except that I had to also make it really interesting. So it took about, I guess, 6 to 8 months to write it. There were parts of it that were ongoing, and so we left those sections open, like we were waiting for a Supreme Court ruling on gerrymandering, and then as things unfolded, I would plug in, we would like leave a page or leave 2 pages, and I would plug in that information at the very end. But it was a bit of a race to the finish to get it out by March 2020, just in time for the pandemic.
Thanks. How about you, Erin?
Yeah, so I first had the idea for the story back in spring of 2017, and I like to plot everything out before I write it. In fact, if I turn this screen, I like to plot everything on a W, if that's a familiar concept. And I literally, you can see I have a W. And I'm plotting something else up here right now. And so each of the little corners are my plot points, and I'll just stick Post-its up there I'm a very visual person, and that's how I start to plot things. So before I even started writing it, I had my entire plot kind of figured out like that. And then I write in a program called Scrivener, which is a fantastic program. I love writing in it. And it literally has a virtual corkboard where you can do that same kind of thing. And you can create a document for each one of those scenes. So what I did is I sat down and I kind of wrote a little 1-sentence description of what I needed each scene to do, so that when I sat down to write, I knew exactly what I was doing every day. I'm a pretty fast drafter, and I got that written in a couple of months, and then did a round of edits. And then I went to the Willamette Writers Conference and pitched it in August of 2017. And I had a few requests from that. And as I said before, the publisher that I ended up going with also requested the full. So of course I went home and then did another round of revisions. And it was tough. I was actually doing, I was working on a production at the time. So I would come home from rehearsals at 10 o'clock and do edits until I was ready to fall asleep and then get that out. So I did that and got those full manuscript requests out in October. And then by January, I had my offer of publication that I decided to go with. So then fast forward, it's kind of a long process sometimes from when you get that offer of publication to when it actually releases. So I didn't actually then start working on it with my editor for publication again until October of 2019. That's when I received my big edit letter so that I could go through and we could move some furniture around, so to speak, to do those big picture edits and revisions. And then in February, March of 2020, we went through and did copy and line edits and got everything finalized for release in June of 2020. So it really was a solid about 3-year process from start to finish.
Wow. How do you keep motivated with a 3-year project? I mean, it must just feel like, is it ever going to happen, you know?
It absolutely feels like that at times. I write other things. I mean, even right now, I'm working on edits on another piece and I'm drafting another one. I kind of like to have my hand in a lot of little things. And I keep track of everything I do. I have like a little journal. In fact, it's sitting right here. And I literally just will write down what I've done. I don't plan in advance. I like to plan in reverse because I don't like to not check off things. So once I've done something, I write it down and put a little check next to it. And it kind of helps me to stay focused and motivated. It's hard. It's been harder, being at home all the time. And I have 2 little boys that they need a lot of attention. And so we're doing a lot of the homeschool experience and a lot of Zoom school as well right now. And so for me, I find that just having that reference where I can look at it and see, oh, I have been doing things, and just being able to loop back and stay connected to it really makes a big difference.
Yeah. Thanks.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Yeah, Erin, I want to see more about the big W.
Oh, the W.
I'm working on a book. It's nonfiction, but I'm writing it like a legal thriller. So I'm really working. I read a book called Plot Perfect about plotting, because I haven't really had to plot very much. So I've never seen the W. Can you just tell me a little bit more about how that works and what you're doing?
Yeah, so I learned this technique there's another author in town that I took a workshop with at one point. Her name is Jennifer Lauk, and she writes memoirs. The one that was really big is called Blackbird, and she's wonderful when it comes to structure. And so I learned this method from her, and it's basically adapting Larry Brooks's book, where he has these he does 4 boxes, but I like the W better, where you kind of have each point is your plot point. So I think of it in terms of this first point down here is your first plot point. That's the point where the story really gets started. And then up here you have your midpoint where, the context of the story changes. And then down here you have your second plot point, which is kind of once you hit that point of no return, right? And you just kind of can feel the momentum of it moving. And I don't know, there's something about it that I just really like to be able to visually see the space that each scene and each component of the story takes. I also just like to be able to physically move things around. Sometimes
is it like a 3-act structure?
Yeah, if you want to think about it in terms of 3-act structure, essentially the first act would be this first line here in the W. The second act would be this kind of triangle in the center. And then your third act would be this last. I'm kind of doing that backwards for you guys, sorry.
Very cool.
So that's how I think about it. And I've done it different places in this room here, but this seems to be, I just use washi tape and Post-its, and then I can move things around so easily. And so this has worked for me. But I think that Larry Brooks's book, where I use a lot of, he frames things so well. It's called Story Engineering, and it's that orange book that it's very popular. It's for a good reason. It's a great book.
Thanks. So switching gears a little bit here, Liz, there's a question for you. You mentioned you had a picture of JFK on your wall when you were younger. And so which politicians inspire you today, would you say?
That's a great question. Let's see. I really love AOC. I just feel like she speaks truth to power in a way that's really exciting. I mean, you'll probably get a sense of my leanings if I also say Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Power to the people. But I will say my book is actually nonpartisan. I really focused on things that there's a huge majority agreement among Republicans and Democrats for these reforms. I didn't write about things that there's a lot of, really a lot of debate around them, if you're actually talking about the American people. So, when I was writing the book, knowing that I tend to have more liberal leanings, I had to really think about my family, which definitely reflects the whole political spectrum. I had to think about, the 8 different states that I've lived in, where my other family and friends live. And really, it's almost like using like the veil of ignorance. Like, if I didn't know what I believed and if I didn't know where I lived, what would be fair? So I had to really, that was something that was actually a challenge. And one of the things I'm really proud about in the reviews is that, people saying that it is, nonpartisan and that it seems really balanced. So I'm really proud of that, even though, as you can tell by who I admire, I do have very strong and liberal leaning political interests.
Okay, thank you. And so Liz, can you talk a little bit about, I know that Erin kind of went from law school to writing fiction, and I'd like to hear from you both about kind of the path you took to become a writer. So Liz, could you talk about, like, did you always want to be a writer, or was there a time when you were something else and a writer, or was it just, well, just
Yeah. So I think that my earliest writing was actually probably playwriting, because I had my best friend Karen Anderson and I used to create plays. Like, often we had like detective stories and fantasies, and we would put on these plays. And I grew up in a big family, so I'd recruit my brothers and sisters to be in our plays. I also I think I wrote some poetry, and I remember writing a story about a girl, and I think I actually still have this. It's on like withered construction paper about a girl named Sharon who races horses, and Sharon's my little sister's name. And I have like chapter 1, I have chapter 2, and I have like, then there's the race, and like that horse was ahead, and number 2 was ahead, and number 1 was ahead, and and then I had the underdog win, which was my sister. So I think I always had that sense. But honestly, I didn't really know what I wanted to be when I grew up, because I was so interested in everything. I loved science. I loved social studies. I read all the time. I played the guitar. I was in musicals. Like, I just was interested in everything. And to me, it seemed really like harsh to have to pick one thing to do and to be and to commit to that. Actually, I was laughing, Erin, when you told me, you said your degrees. I have a degree in economics in college, because it was the subject I knew the least about. So I knew I would learn the most. That was literally the only reason I studied it. And then I did end up getting a master's degree in public policy. But my path to writing was really, I realized that as a writer, I can write about anything in the whole world that interests me. So I write about science, I write about history, I write fiction, and I write nonfiction. I write for young people and I write for adults. I even have a graphic novel published. So for me, it's like the wide open world that writing gives me. And that's why I became a writer and what I love about it.
Thanks. Erin, how about you? There was a question about, was it a difficult change to pivot your career path away from law school to writing?
It was a big pivot. Yeah. When I was in law school, I was probably about, I don't know, 2/3 of the way through when I realized I didn't want to practice law. I focused on constitutional law and education law when I was in school, and clerked for some firms that did plaintiff side employment discrimination cases. So I was, and that was really near and dear to my heart, but it was so adversarial, and I didn't want to be in a courtroom. Like I said before, I'm a very creative person. Elizabeth, I think you and I would get along very well. all the show tunes all the time. And I just wanted to be creative, and I wanted to, I don't know, like I've always wanted to be a helper. And so there's that piece of me as well. But it's kind of like what Elizabeth said, like there are all these interests that I have, and I wanted to be able to marry them all into something that I really loved. And with writing, you can do whatever, you can write whatever you want. That said, when you read my writing, my background in, from law school and having studied political science and from theater and all of these things, it absolutely colors what I write. And I think that's the beauty of writers, is that you can come from anywhere, and that varied background is what makes every book so unique and so different. I do think that I learned a lot about writing in law school, and there are still some tendencies that I carried from that that have made me a stronger writer. For example, I really do like to just stick with the story, just tell the story. And I start with that. I always just tell the story. And then I go back and we talked about, or I mentioned this, that you can edit a lot. You can edit a lot away. And so that just, I do tend to kind of streamline my stories and make them very, I like to have tight pacing for that reason. But for as big of a pivot as it seems, it also doesn't seem like it's like, it feels very close and connected to me, because as an attorney, you're writing all the time and you're thinking of creative solutions to things and problem solving. And so, yes, it's a big pivot, but it's also not so much.
Thanks. I think the last question from Paige is, if you could talk about, both of you could talk about a book that you would encourage students to read that inspired you or that you thought was just fun to read. And I'm putting you both on the spot.
Yeah, it's a matter of like picking one. Oh dear. Because my book is nonfiction, I'll share a nonfiction title that I really admire. Actually, what I love about it is it's actually a compilation. So there's a nonfiction writer named John McPhee. He writes a lot for the New Yorker, but he also has published a bunch of, full-length books on different topics. And there's a book called The John McPhee Reader, and what it is a sampling from a number of his different works that ran in the New Yorker and other places. And what I love about him is that he's really interested in structure. So it's not just like a list of facts. He's a storyteller. I try to think of myself as a storyteller too, as a nonfiction writer, but he tries to create a structure for the story that mirrors what the subject matter is. So like he was writing about a curator for the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it's called A Room Full of Hovings. And basically he tells this guy's story as if you're going through an art museum, learning about him and his different stages in life, right? So like that really creative way of illuminating your subject matter with a really creative structure. And all his pieces are really brilliant too, because like there's topics that I don't really think I care about, and then I'll find myself completely sucked in, which I think is a sign of excellent nonfiction writing. So the John McPhee Reader, or anything by John McPhee.
Yeah, he's a great writer. Erin, how about you?
I had a moment to think about it now.
Yes.
I would actually say I love Seanan McGuire so much. If I could just say one person I wish I could write like Seanan McGuire. So I would suggest Every Heart a Doorway. It's a novella that she wrote, and it's the start of a series called the Wayward Children series. And the premise is that you have all of these children in the world who have at one point in time gone through the looking glass. They've gone into a portal world, but they've all come back, and their parents don't know what to do with them. So they send them to this special school where they take in these children and let them kind of live out their fantasies. But then, of course, all these children want to go back to the other world. And so it's told from the point of view of the children, and it often gets shelved in middle grade, but I think it's more of a YA book, really. And it's such a beautiful series, and they're short. They truly are novellas, and every single word is intentional. There's not a single word that's wasted, and they're so rich, and you just like it just grabs your heart. It really is like that heart squeeze. I love those books so much. So Every Heart a Doorway by Seanan McGuire.
Thanks. Well, thank you all for being here. Are there any other, I think we're done with the questions. Paige, did you have anything you wanted to add, or?
No, I just wanted to say thank you for sharing today, and I appreciate the editorial advice as the teacher to the students who are here today. I need to take that for myself as well, to get something down on the page, and then you'll have something to work with.
Yeah,
So thanks so much for sharing that today.
it's great advice. Okay, well, thank you all for being here. I hope you tune into the archive project on May 2nd. Yeah, this has been great, and we will we will post this. Thank you. I'm going to stop recording.